Hello, greetings, school directors and friends of public education. Thanks for joining us for today's InSession Live. It is Thursday, March 13th. We acknowledge that our public schools and facilities operate on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. As we engage in the 2025 legislative session, we remember that the lands of our state capital were cared for by the people of the Squaxin and Nisqually tribes. We make these acknowledgments to open a space of recognition, inclusion, and respect for our sovereign tribal partners and all Indigenous students, families, staff, legislators, and board members in our communities. Yesterday was the end of the House of Origin cutoff, which means that all House bills had to make it out of the House and all Senate bills had to make it out of the Senate in order for them to progress. So today is the first day of the opposite chamber process. So basically, we're on repeat from where we started at the very beginning of session. Just we'll see Senate bills in the House and House bills in the Senate. Um, there's one exception to that rule. Perhaps you've heard of the acronym NTIB. Necessary to implement the budget has no official definition in state statute or on the legislative website. But if you ask generative AI, they have a pretty good answer. And it's essentially that really it's any bill that's deemed necessary to implement the budget. Makes sense, right? Based on the acronym itself. Essentially, what that means is that there will be bills that did not progress past their House of Origin floor debate. However, if they are determined necessary in order to pass a budget, which is the only thing that the legislature has to do in order to end the legislative session, they could bring a bill back or parts of a bill back in order to ensure that passing a budget was possible. As you see there from generative AI, this label is used liberally to prevent legislation from dying, most specifically in order to pass a budget. So I'm going to talk more about some of those bills that may be dead, maybe not, in my section. But before I give you sort of an update on what's going on generally about the 2025 legislative session, I am pleased to be able to introduce or reintroduce to you Randy Spalding, who is the executive director of the State Board of Education. The State Board has been doing a really wonderful job of keeping the community, Washingtonians, public education advocates, employees, and other staff informed about the work they are doing called Future Ready around graduation requirements vision for the future. There was earlier this week a public meeting that anybody could listen in on, but knowing that many of you have busy professional and personal lives may not have been able to attend. So we invited Randy here today to speak a little bit broadly to the work of the State Board of Education as it relates to their vision for graduation, as well as give us an update on how some of the bills that might impact graduation requirements around financial literacy and computer science in particular are being considered as a part of that planning process. So thank you, Randy, for your leadership and your friendship and for being here with us today for InSession. I'm going to take my screen off and let you take it from here.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I think I clicked on something wrong, so it might take me just a moment to get reoriented here. But let me go ahead and share this. And then, okay, now I'm back. Can you see the slides?
We sure can. They look great.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Good afternoon. I'm happy to share about the board's Future Ready initiative. I'm Randy Spalding, Executive Director for the State Board of Education. As you all know, the State Board of Education is a 16-member board made up of elected and appointed officials. Two of them are current high school students, and 5 members, of course, are elected by local school board members. The board provides oversight and advocates for our system of education in Washington. The board recently adopted our 24 through 28 strategic plan, which articulates our mission to cultivate an equitable and inclusive K-12 education system that fulfills the board's vision of every student being empowered with the knowledge and skills they need to thrive in a changing world. And we do this work through engaging with our communities. And this is the strategic plan this time around is a little bit different than a traditional plan in that it really is emphasizing more heavily our approach than a specific set of initiatives or outcomes that we are hoping to achieve, at least in specific policies. So it's much broader. It's about a process, and that those broader outcomes are the kinds of things I just mentioned through the mission and vision statement. And doing this work through authentic engagement with our communities. And so this is really changing how we approach our work. And so to go a little bit deeper on that, we are the Future Ready initiative I'm going to talk more about, but it's really an example of how we're trying to bring together our community members in a way that helps work with the board in the development of our strategies and to help us move forward on that. And that is really a response to the board's own work and kind of reflecting on how we best serve the community, but also is consistent with executive orders and statutory language that really is pushing for that broader sense of engagement with those that we serve. And as I noted, the board has responsibility for the graduation requirements. Specifically, the board establishes the requirements, but also is asked in statute to periodically reevaluate the requirements and propose changes to the requirements. And so Future Ready is our strategy, is outlined as one of the key elements of our strategic plan, and it's really intended to take a comprehensive view of potential changes to the graduation requirements. And this is in recognition of the fact that we've seen over time a number of incremental changes. We continue to see proposals for additional changes. And our stance on this has been we need to slow down and take a step back and look at the whole and really understand better what we're asking of our students, of our schools, to really ensure that we're meeting the goals that we have established for students when they leave our system. And so one thing just important to note is, and I think this is probably already apparent from some of my comments, but we are not at this moment proposing changes. We're talking about a process to review and make recommendations for changes in the future. So this is not there's not a specific change that we're pushing at the moment. And this chart is something that we've introduced into our policy thinking and find it to be very helpful. It's called a Venn diagram, and I have to credit Jay Lee for bringing this to the agency, Jay Lee Schultz. And it's intended to express two seemingly contradictory items that are both true at the same time. And so this is not enough and too much with regard to the graduation requirements. So some specific examples that we are hearing from folks is that on the one hand, students are asking for more opportunity to develop critical skills in areas that maybe aren't addressed currently in the requirements. And at the same time, they're expressing that the current requirements are overly complex, too much, maybe not flexible enough, those kinds of things. And so we recognize that both of these things can be true at the same time. And this is really what's a big part of the work that we're moving forward on. And so just to go a little deeper again into the objectives for the Future Ready initiative, we have adopted also in our strategic plan a profile of a graduate. This is a state level articulation of what students, those cross-cutting skills students should be developing while they're in school. It really is bringing together the goals of basic education and the outcomes of the high school diploma, what the high school diploma would signal, but then also identifying that set of cross-cutting skills. You might think of them, some of them would be reflected in things like 21st century skills or some of these other skills discussions that folks are having around. But it's really that what do we want students to know and be able to do and be working on or towards as they leave our system. And then, again, looking at how we are balancing core and elective courses, what are the essential skills, interdisciplinary learning opportunities for that, and a host of other elements. So this is again guiding kind of what the scope of the work for the Future Ready task force is, and what we are hoping to achieve. We have designed this work to be iterative over time. And so we have a task force that is meeting every other month. And you'll see here in a moment, it's in a cadence that allows the board to have discussions in between those. But we also have community liaisons who are compensated for their time and effort, both on the task force and reaching out to community to gather information and bring that back to the task force meetings. And then we will be starting subcommittees to dive into specific issues that are coming up through this work. And so that may be a deeper dive into a subject area, but it may be issues like how do we implement this with fidelity in a way that creates the best opportunities for students and gives districts the resources and time they need in order to do the implementation on this. The task force is made up of a broad range of folks. We've really been intentional. We're trying to keep this to a reasonable size so that it's manageable and they can get actual work done, but also has broad representation. And so to do that, we went out to partners. We asked them to help us identify folks who could sit on this task force who met a few different criteria. One is we really hoping to bring people in that wore multiple hats. We're also wanting to bring people in who have connections with a variety of communities and can do outreach in between to connect with those and again, bring feedback back to the table. So that's been our approach on this. We have about 35 folks on the task force. And so that's going forward. Now, I kind of covered this, but just to reiterate, we have our task force. We have community liaisons who are those specific task force members who are reaching out to community groups. And then we also will be implementing subcommittees. So the specifics of the subcommittees will emerge from the work. And so we don't have a list of subcommittees right now, but as I mentioned, probably deeper dives into some subject areas as well as issues around implementation, and there may be a few other things that come out of our work. The timeline on this, we are currently in the first phase of a 3-phase project, and we're kind of on the second half of phase 1, and the next meeting, which is coming up in actually a week and a half, I think, we'll be talking about visioning, and we'll take that conversation back to the board, and then we will go back to the work group to move towards our next steps from that. In phase 2 is when we would start beginning to develop recommendations, and then finally this will end in recommendations or a legislative proposal in the 3rd phase of the work. That would be in early 26. And so you can see on here, the task force meets every other month, the board meetings, between the board meetings, essentially. So we're creating this conversation between the board and the task force. And we do have board members serving on the task force as well. Again, another note, I noted at the top, we don't have a specific recommendation. When we do make recommendations, we're also mindful that those have to be phased in over a period of time. Generally speaking, any new requirements can only be implemented with an entering freshman class. That would make class of 2031 about the earliest we could see any new requirements. And some things may take longer to phase in depending on the nature of the recommendations. And that was true the last time we had a major change in the grad requirements as well, where some things took longer than others to bring into the system. So Marissa mentioned legislative activity. There are not as many bills this year as last year, but a couple of bills that are really addressing areas that would touch on graduation requirements. And the two that seem to be moving the most, we have the 1285, which is the financial education bill from the House. And that has passed the House and is now been referred to early learning K-12 in the Senate. I checked last night and it hadn't been scheduled yet, but it's very early for that. So not, I'm sure that will come soon. And that bill would require that students demonstrate that they meet the financial education standards as a condition for graduation by the class of 31. And high schools would have to offer the opportunity to meet the standards by the 27-28 school year. So this particular bill, the timeline is consistent with Future Ready, and there's some other language in there that kind of creates that consistency. But the key caveat is it does presume that there would be a requirement. So the approach we're taking in the initiative is we're trying not to presume what new requirements might come out, and this bill does kind of advance a specific requirement. It leaves open, however, how that might be implemented. So unlike some legislation you've seen in the past, it doesn't require a specific course or anything like that, but it does require that students meet the standards. 5327 is actually a little bit more open and less prescriptive in that same sense, where in that case, it is requiring the board to consider an approach and a timeline to ensure students have adequate opportunity to demonstrate fundamental skills, in this case, both in computer science and in financial literacy. That one is so it's a little bit more open in terms of how and when exactly that would get implemented. Again, it is consistent with the timeline in Future Ready. So we really appreciated the sponsors on both of these bills being sensitive to that work that the board is engaged in and willing to make those adjustments in their bills. The 5327 has been scheduled for a public hearing on the 18th in the House. So that one is we do know when that one's coming up. So I talked really fast, but that is the last of my content slides. And we do have some resources in the slides as well. And I assume this deck's going to go out to folks. So if you want to sign up for updates or see some of additional information on this, we can certainly accommodate that. So
Thank you so much, Randy. Yeah,
sure
the
thing.
for the benefit of the whole, the in-session live agenda does have a presentation link, and this presentation is therefore available to our audience. A couple questions. Thank you so much. That was a great overview. I am curious about, and maybe this is an OSPI question as much as is a question for you about learning standards. Familiar with OSPI doing some updates to math and English language arts. How does that impact the future ready planning, or does it at all? Are their processes operating sort of simultaneously but can be paired? Just curious about how they interplay.
Yeah, those we haven't brought those two conversations together. I think where it would potentially be an issue is if we saw something that might change the course requirements. So the board's work is at that sort of course level, and the learning standards are a little more specific. But if we saw something that kind of changed the nature of the math sequence, for example,
Sure.
then that might be a time where we'd have to bring that conversation in a little bit more explicitly.
Nice. That's helpful. How has either intentionally or accidentally school board level perspective already been included sort of in your process to date, or could be in the future? Where might our members have a chance to provide any feedback?
Uh, yeah, that's a good question, and um, uh, excuse me, I was looking for my list, but yeah, the opportunities. So first off, that the problem statement that we're addressing really comes out of a lot of listening the board has done, both at, visiting with school board members, but also educators, students, others. So over the last several years, the board's been getting this same feedback about there's too much on the plate, it's not flexible enough, and we want students to be able to learn these things that they maybe haven't had an opportunity to learn yet. And so really trying to reconcile all that. So that problem statement comes absolutely out of that. In terms of the work going forward, the that outreach that we're doing as part of the Future Ready, I would say they should sign up for our Future Ready announcements. The meetings are all open meetings. And then at the board meetings, of course, public comment is available, but we can be available as well to connect with folks. And I'll be doing as many of the regional visits as possible as well this year. So, and so will members. So there's those kinds of connections that I think would be the best way to do that.
Yeah, so just for the benefit again of the audience, if folks had questions or comments that they wanted to share, there are a couple mechanisms that they could do it. They could attend one of the public meetings that you're advertising, and they would learn about that from signing up for the Future Ready announcements. Anybody can do that. They could also just email me because I have a close working relationship with you and Jay Lee. We can make connections there. So I'll just keep that door open. And then, of course, you always are so generous with your time during our spring regional meetings by attending as many of those as possible. So our members who attend the regional meetings might get a chance to meet you live in person and ask you questions there. So all of those are great opportunities to engage in the process. One last question. I know the answer to this. I think the answer is no, but I want you to verify. Was there any funding? Has there been any funding discussion around the two bills in play right now for financial literacy or computer science? My understanding is the answer is no, because the assumption by our legislatures is that it would be no additional cost to districts because they are embedding existing learning standards into current courses. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, I'd have to. I didn't refresh my memory of the fiscal note before this call, but the other element, at least on the because the how is not defined yet, and in the case of the Senate bill, there's not actually a requirement imposed yet, so that those would also impact that inability to have a fiscal impact shown.
Yeah, the Senate bill is more of a integrating into the system that you're describing so that there's some conversation and embedding of the learning standards there. Whereas
Yeah.
House bill is specifically about financial education being a graduation requirement, but existing within however districts are currently offering graduation requirements, the learning standards could be, let's call it sprinkled or embedded in all of the existing courses that they're currently offering. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, because it doesn't specify like with civics we have standard load course requirement. That's not what we're seeing on the financial ed side.
Great. And then one more question. If there are any vacancies on the task force that you currently have, how might someone express an interest or be identified to fill that vacancy?
We are not adding members at this point in time. However, as I mentioned, the meetings are open. If you sign up, we can get you there and you can attend those meetings.
Okay, great. And then Jackie pointed out she thinks one of those bills includes a null and void clause, so would not go into effect unless funded. I'm not sure if that's still true, Jackie. So
I think that's in the House bill. There is a null and void in it.
there's null and void.
But I'm not. You'd have to look at the fiscal note to see what funded means.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's not going to increase your MSOC allocation or your prototypical school funding model by any means of the imagination. So So yeah, what null and void means, it directly relates to the fiscal note, which may or may not accurately reflect what your district would need to make changes in this regard. There is some level of assumption by legislators that more than half of the school districts are already providing at least some, if not all, of the learning standards for financial literacy. Something you wanted to add to that, Randy?
Yeah, actually, it's already required that the switch provide these learning standards, so that's already required in the lawsuit. That's also affecting that. They don't, so the other thing I would say is that there's also work assigned to three different agencies. So it's State Board, English Education Public-Private Partnership, and OSPI each have worked on that bill. And so that's probably where the funding in that bill would land. Yeah, I have to just remote on that.
I was having a little trouble hearing you. You sounded kind of garbly.
Sorry.
Um,
Yeah, let me say it again. So what I said, there are three agencies that are identified in that bill with work. So the financial education, the private partnership, OSPI, and SPE. And so that's I think where most of that funding will go in the bill. They have to look at the fiscal note to confirm on
okay.
that. But the other thing I was saying is that you're right to say that there's already a law that says districts have to offer the financial aid learning standards and computer science actually as well. And so I think that also is affecting the analysis of the cost on some of that.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
your audio is coming across as a little garbly, but I think what I got in a nutshell is that the funding is largely for the systems development for the Senate bill and also for the House bill. And there's some assumption already that many school districts are already doing this. Cool. Well, I might have to say goodbye to you because I don't know if we could hear you even if we asked a question or not. I can hear you. It just does sound like you're scuba diving, which sounds more fun than a legislative session, to be honest. So
But I hope it wasn't that way throughout. Is it?
no, it wasn't. Nope. And now
Yeah.
you're good. Yep.
Okay.
Let me see. Now it sounds like you're fine. So let me see if there's uh there's a question about any interplay between the federal government and the state of Washington. She said something about pro-equity and anti-racism. I'm not sure that those are embedded into financial literacy learning standards, but anything you would offer there?
Oh yeah, I think probably referring to one of the slides in my deck on PAIR, which is that's it comes out of executive directive and the governor's office of equity, and so that's directive at the state level to agencies to address equity issues. In particular, our work in that area is focused on community engagement and outreach, and that work is absolutely going to continue.
Yeah, and is state directed, which is the law at present. So we're operating under those guideline, not just guidelines, but laws. So thank you,
Yep.
Randy. Appreciate your time
Thanks.
and attention and for all the work that you're doing to do this um, deliberately and intentionally. Um,
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
thanks, Randy. Great. All right. Thank you, everybody. Great questions and appreciate your attention to that. I really like when we get to talk about student-centered approaches to the work that we're doing. Oftentimes we've got lots of other things in play, although focusing on school funding obviously is very student-centered. But obviously that's not the first thing that comes out of our mouth all the time right now. So we got to keep that fully present. I am going to return back to our agenda as sort of a guide for what we'll be talking about next. Wanted to give you a little bit of an update on how things are going. Screen sharing pause. Now it's ready. One thing I just wanted to let you know, I mentioned earlier that last night was the end of the Chamber of Origin process. So House bills out of the House, Senate bills out of the House. That ended in the Senate around 5:15. The very last bill was Senate Bill 5263. And they just went a little over time last night. I think they ended at about 5:20 or so. But there's about 30 minutes, I would say, a very compelling and beautiful student-centered, student-forward, education-focused floor speeches from Republicans and Democrats alike on the Senate side. I provided a hyperlink to that segment of yesterday's very long floor speech segments. I would highly encourage you to watch and or listen to that by clicking on that link. It might be around 35 minutes in total. It was so heartening for me to hear that last night, at a time over the last couple weeks when we've seen some of our very favorite special education and material supplies operating cost bills get diminished in terms of their total funding allocation amounts. And we also saw transportation bills not progress any further onto the floor. It was really, like I said, I can't think of a better word than heartening at a time when many of us have been feeling like, we had a lot of the momentum around our member adopted priorities, particularly special education, MSOC, and transportation. Felt like we'd been backsliding a little bit over the last couple weeks, but these floor speeches really helped a lot of us who were watching last night feel like there is still a commitment to this, not just basic education requirement, but to this moral, ethical, and legal obligation to support and serve students with disabilities across the board. So, not saying it's going to be easy or the 1 billion that they're talking about will be fully allocated at the end of the day, but I will tell you it's clear from listening to the senators, both Republicans and Democrats, that they understand the need and their responsibility there. This bill will now progress over to House Appropriations. So it's been referred to House Appropriations, and I do anticipate we'll hear it over there at some point. Whether or not it stays at the same funding level as it's currently set remains to be seen, especially since on the House side, they did not progress 1310, which was Representative Paulette's full funding of special education. They instead progressed Monica Stonier's 1357, which was an increase to the multiplier, no addressing of the cap, and some advancement on inclusionary practices. That bill did not progress out of the House either. So 5263 is our special education vehicle, and it was looking pretty darn good as of last night. Just a reminder that if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A, and I'll get to it as soon as possible. Then I also want to talk a little bit about what's happening next week. I'm going to actually pull up a slide deck here in a moment just to keep us on track as it relates to that. Before I move over there, though, I wanted to remind you that there will be an opportunity for you over the course of the next couple days. Most of you will have legislators, at least one, if not all three or more, who are delivering town hall presentations, possibly in person, maybe virtually, on Saturday this weekend. The full schedules here for House and Senate are provided at these hyperlinks. You might have to do a little bit of digging to find your individual legislators and when they're offering. A lot of times they're coming together to do those together. Not always, but sometimes. So I would just check those out. And if you have any availability to attend or tune in, there's a lot that you'll be able to learn from them about how they're thinking about some of the policies we care most about and what some of the other issue areas that are taking their time and attention will be. So I'm going to pull up the slide deck, and that will get us back on track here. I was just so excited about last night's floor speeches. I just really wanted to start with that as a reminder that they are still paying attention. So just a little overview and update as it relates to the 105-day session that we are currently in. There are 60 days behind us and 45 days remaining in the regular session. There is still some rumor and will remain to be a rumor until a fact whether or not we will sine die or end the legislative session on April 27th, or if there will be a special session. That will depend on a lot of variables, most specifically, as you are well aware, that we have a significant budget shortfall in our state. That will be the primary focus, has been the primary focus of our legislature, and will continue to be their focus moving into the end of session. They have to determine which cuts they're going to make, what revenue they're going to pass, and how they can at least level things out and respond to the shortfall. And then if they have any additional policies that they're adding, like special education funding, how are they going to pay for that? Is that additional cuts, or is that additional revenue or taxes that they will need to address? It's quite the balancing act, and we're just one sector of a very comprehensive state system that they'll have to address as they continue to balance the budget. I've said this many times, House of Origin ended yesterday. We'll see a revenue forecast come out next week that will inevitably influence how they're thinking about that cuts in revenue balance and which policies they need to support. Then we will also see policies continue to drop off the process at the next cutoff, which happens April 2nd, just right around the corner. So that means that any bills that made it out of the House that were referred to Senate Early Learning and K-12 as an example will have to be passed out of that committee by April 2nd, and then passed out of the Fiscal Committee, Senate Ways and Means, by April 8th, and then debated on the floor for passage before sine die. So we've seen a lot of bills, more bills drop off of our bill list than remain. However, there are still some in play, and that's why we will be having more hearings starting today. House Education and Senate Early Learning and K-12 met today for the first time in several weeks to start addressing some of the bills that are still in play. I gave a little bit of an overview as it relates to this, but this gives you sort of a full picture of WSSDA legislative priorities and bills that matched those priorities in these key categories: SPED, MSOC, transportation, and staffing. You'll see the word dead on most of these, and that is true. The special education bill, as I referenced, passed last night, so we'll see that progress over to the House. The material supplies and operating cost bill, the vehicle that progresses is 5192, has already been scheduled in House Appropriations next Wednesday at 4 p.m. I have provided on the agenda a direct link for where you can go to provide your sign-in, I would assume, of support. It is not at the level that we would want it to be. This bill in particular doesn't get us to the full met need, but it is our best vehicle at present. And the legislature will continue to dial these numbers back and forth as these bills progressed, and as conversations are happening behind closed doors about how they balance that budget. I say dead, bills are dead, recognizing that any bill as it relates to the budget could be resurrected or come back as it might be deemed necessary to implement the budget. And also a reminder that any of these bills that say dead beside them are still in play for the 2026 legislative session. So they die for this session, but they all return as alive for next session, and just will have to go through the process in order to stay alive. I'm going to check out some of the questions here as they may be relevant. How can you tell if a bill is necessary to implement the budget or dead? Well, you can't until the budget's passed. So I guess what I would tell you is that for the most part, with all of these bills, we assume that any numbers are in play until we see some of the drafts of the budget. We will likely see, like with this transportation budget, 5187 did not progress to the Senate floor. However, we have heard that the Senate is committed to having some element of funding for special passengers in their proposed budget, which we will see in the next week or two. I won't be surprised to see some funding allocated for special passengers, specifically students experiencing homelessness. I doubt we'll see that in the House version of the budget because the House did not progress a transportation budget. And therein lies one of the thousands of places the House and the Senate will be in negotiation before we see a final version of the budget. I know that's kind of a non-answer, but that's the best answer I can give given the realities of the legislative session. Yes, I will upload this into the chat for you all. Okay, progressing towards some of the in this PowerPoint presentation, there's an overview here of where the current versions of MSOC and SPED are. I would tell you don't get too excited or too depressed about any one of these numbers because all of this is subject to change. I will note though that the trajectory of both the MSOC and SPED bills has been on a downward slide. So they started higher, and we've seen them gradually reducing the allocation amounts in all areas. So that probably is the more likely direction. I think our best hope is that they are maintained at this level, and that we encourage our legislators to hold firm at these levels, assuming that they won't bring them back up. If there is any way you are able to communicate to your legislators, this is where our MSOC and our special education gap is, or need is. This is where these two bills would fund us, is down here. So invariably, you'll have the number in between that identifies the gap between actual need and what these bills would fund, because that number in between is what we'll be coming back for next year to ask for. So they should be aware that this is a conversation we're going to continue until our schools are adequately funded for basic education. There have been lots of other policy issues we've talked about throughout the session. Many of them have fallen off the bill watch list. Again, they could be back next year. But I wanted to let you know that the simple majority bill did not progress to the Senate floor. Some people are saying there might be a remaining opportunity for it to continue into the conversation at the end of the budget negotiation. This would be a stretch to say that it's necessary to implement the budget. However, if there's a tie to some kind of negotiation where there's a cost savings in support of simple majority, perhaps they'd be able to tie it like this bill did with impact fees, but we may not see this bill progress this session. I think that's probably a more likely outcome, but we are still working behind the scenes to keep it alive in the case that there's still an opportunity. Transition to kindergarten, neither the House or the Senate bill progressed. The House bill did not make it past appropriations. The Senate bill did make it past Ways and Means, but was not debated on the Senate floor. However, I do think we're going to see this issue addressed in both the House and the Senate proposed budgets, because there is a consideration that either by maintaining the current level, which is what the Senate version would have done, or reducing the current level, which is what the House version would have done, that there would either be a current cost savings or a projected cost savings, because it wouldn't, if they went with the Senate bill, it would just hold the enrollment at what it currently is, as opposed to having to fund for the future. This is not basic education protected. Therefore, those are the areas where the legislature is looking to try to identify potential cuts. They may refer to them as savings, so that they can fund other obligations or other policies that they intend to pass. Depreciation for EV buses. This is a bill that's being heard today. Electric vehicle, sorry, that's what EV stands for. We are trying to get clarity on whether or not that includes electric vehicle buses that you have already received, or if this would be for bills that you receive buses you receive in the future. So we're still working out the kinks on this one, but we are concerned that if you already accepted a grant where an electric vehicle was granted to you, that you should not be on the hook to reimburse the state for depreciation on those buses. And then last but not least on this slide, in a bill hearing today, WSSDA Board President Derek Sarley will be representing WSSDA in opposition to this bill. This essentially reduces, doesn't fully cut the National Board Certified Teacher Program. You could call them bonuses, but they are commitments from our legislature for over 20 years. And our highly qualified teachers have come to expect these as part of their salary. This isn't protected in basic education as part of the prototypical school funding model. Therefore, it's another one that's at risk of being cut. I think probably we'll see a reduction to the amount. The substitute bill that will be heard in committee today reduces the current commitment to a lower number than is currently expected, but it doesn't eliminate it entirely. If you remember at the beginning of session, Governor Inslee's proposed operating budget would have eliminated this program entirely. So this bill is better than that, but it's not what we want. Then a couple other policies, just want to keep you aware of. Unemployment insurance for striking workers. WASA and WSSDA drafted a joint letter that was shared with the entire Senate last week before it came to a floor vote. We understood that it had strong majority support. There were 2 dissenting votes on the Democrat side, and Senator Wellman was one of them, although she has been informed that it won't affect school districts because school district employees are not legally allowed to strike. We all understand the reality of that and therefore understand that this could be what we would consider an unfunded mandate and undue burden to our school districts. So we will continue to fight it on the House side. It is being heard in committee next week and has already been scheduled for an executive session, which means there is strong support, even stronger support on the House side than the Senate side for this bill to pass. We will continue to represent membership in concern about this bill, and am afraid there's sort of universal support for it amongst Democrats, the majority on both the House and Senate side this session. A couple more bills just to note. Senate Bill 5772 would require that any school district whose student enrollment exceeds 33% of ALE, so if more than 33% of your student enrollment are ALE students, then that would reduce your local effort assistance allocation. That bill did not progress to the Senate floor, but because it is one of those considerations for areas of cut outside of basic education, which is protected, we may see this as necessary to implement the budget. You heard from Randy about 1285. It has been referred to Senate Early Learning, so I imagine we'll see that in committee over there. And then we have discussed this bill previously, Senate Bill 5179, which creates a local complaint process when a school director or superintendent is deemed as woefully disobeying the law, that there is a process in place that the school board must host public comment opportunities to address those concerns and complaints, and gives OSPI the opportunity to intervene and redirect up to 20% of your state apportionment to correct the wrongdoing until the wrongdoing is corrected. Something to keep an eye on. That's all for my slides. I will share that in the chat. I'm going to stop my share. I see that there are quite a few questions here. And I'm going to get to those. Hold tight. I was in the office yesterday, and the wonderful Chris Lewis, who is our IT and tech support, did lots of things to fix my computer, but it is still giving me fits. I think it's tired. I think it's because, it's day 60 of the legislative session. It's like, what the heck? Question about House Bill 1296. This was a bill that was actually the last bill on the House floor last night, debated extensively until 2:30 in the morning. WSSDA has weighed in with the bill sponsor to express concerns about the withholding of state apportionment in response to local complaints for willful disobedience of the law, very similar to the concerns we've expressed on Senate Bill 5179. So we remain focused on that element of the bill from the perspective of cost to districts, local control, creating really burdensome processes for the local district when there are already processes in place. WSDA has no clear positions as it relates to some of the other bills in play that are highly controversial, that are most specifically around gender inclusivity and gender expansive schools. That language is not currently in any of our member adopted positions. We do have positions around comprehensive school and student safety. From that perspective, members could be considering how they might support those bills or express their concerns, which is why we have encouraged school districts to weigh in individually on how those individual bills would impact them. Let's see, I am going to clarify the difference between categories on slide 5. I'm going to pull that back in a second. Question about 5041. Is there any funding for unemployment insurance? Not directly as a part of the fiscal note, no. So that would be our main concern, is that it would create financial hardship for districts. Procedural question about 5737 NTIB. Sorry, I don't have all the bills memorized. So a procedural question about NTIB. So again, going back to the original definition of NTIB, there's really no definition of what NTIB is. And if a legislature or group of legislators determine that a bill is necessary to implement the budget, they can bring it back regardless if it progressed through the standard process. Oftentimes those are fiscal related bills. So bills that have some kind of fiscal implication that they could deem, again, I keep having to say, necessary to implement the budget. It really is. That's what they will determine in order to bring it back. So there is no clear definition. And even if a bill didn't progress through the process on its House of Origin side, necessary to implement the budget could still apply. So that's why I recommend you don't let any bill off your radar, because it potentially will come back. We'll be able to tell you when we take a look at both the draft House and the draft Senate budgets over the course of the next 2 weeks once they come out. Our understanding is the House gets to go first this year, and then we'll see a Senate version quickly after. There will be really smart people who understand budget things who will do side by side for education and what the key differences are between those two. And that's where we'll see which bills they may be determining are necessary to implement the budget. For instance, if we see that there's a line item reducing the current allocation for National Board Certified Teachers, well, actually, that bill is currently in play. Let me think of a better example. 5772 is the ALE an LEA bill, which did not progress through the Senate. We may see some kind of reduction in allocation for LEA for particular school districts whose student enrollment exceeds 33% of their total enrollment. That would be what we understand, a $13 million cost savings to the state. So we'll see that potentially in the Senate version of the budget, which would mean that bill was determined necessary to implement the budget. But we won't know until we see the drafts of those budgets. Hope that answered your question. Again, it's kind of a non-answer because it's very confusing. Any idea what the impact of 1531? Again, I don't have numbers completely memorized, so let me go ahead and pull up the slideshow because there was a question about the difference in categories between some things on slide 5. I'm looking at it. It's the slide in reference is the slide on 5263. I'm not seeing anything as it relates to categories. So maybe if the person who asked that question can just reach out to me directly, we can handle that together. And 5131, let me take a look at that. I'm going to pull up this week's bill schedule and bill watch list. And this is how I navigate this, which you can download from the WSSDA website under the legislative updates page. Mm-hmm. Looking for the bill. Ah, sorry, I inverted the numbers. 1531. Also don't see that bill on the bill watch. So I can go to the Washington State Legislature online website, or we can handle it individually. Let me just make sure I'm looking at all the questions here. Uh, um, Oh, I see, Jackie. Thank you. So Jackie's asking questions about the funding amounts for MSOC. Let me go ahead and pull the slide up. Thanks for your patience, folks. So Jackie, I believe your question is what's the difference between the categories here? So this is your base, this is the base level, the 1656. And again, this is the current version of the bill. So again, don't get too locked into dollars and cents here. This would be most likely the minimum number that they would fund. So this would be the base, and then you're looking at a 9th and 12th grade enhancement here. And then additional allocations for MSOC K-12 across the board and 9-12. I don't know if that makes sense to you. So that you've got the total sum, then you've got specific enhancements based on these categories here. There was also a really great side-by-side document that we provided in InSession last week that might sort of illuminate this question a little bit more helpfully. That's going to be tough for me to call out here in the next 2 minutes. So I would recommend going to the WSSDA website, pulling up last week's InSession and going to the MSOC side-by-side document. That'll give you another way of looking at that that's not in a slide that might be a little bit more helpful. Okay, we're about out of time. Still have a question about 1531, and I will look into that. I don't know it off the top of my head because I don't have that one memorized. But Peggy, if you want to reach out to me directly, we can figure that out together. Otherwise, I would say to all of you, please continue fighting. And I don't mean fighting like with fists and mean words. I mean fighting with hearts and data and stories by communicating directly with your legislators. Again, what your need is, what you're able to do when dollars are allocated for student-centered approaches to learning and service. And in the absence of filling that gap where you are now. So where you are now, what you need, and where they are trying to move the needle, what that will get you and what you could get if the full gap was closed. Keep using and relying on your business officers, your superintendent, the people who are boots on the ground to communicate the message, including your students. A great opportunity to have your voice heard. And then my last ask would be, please do make sure that you sign in for 5192 to be heard next Wednesday in House Appropriations. Fill that sign-in sheet with an indication of your need and support. Okay, thank you so much. Talk to you soon.